Websites and web development have been around now for decades and have gone from creating static markup in Notepad to large-scale enterprise development with every tool and technology and platform imaginable. Regardless of the methods and concepts surrounding the creation of websites, the challenges have mostly stayed the same. How does an organization manage authorization, authentication, scaling, service integration, and user management in a way that's both seamless and transparent to an end user and easy to manage and deploy for administrators and developers? One of the first big attempts at this came in the late 90s with Microsoft's Visual InterDev, a forerunner to Visual Studio. And since that time, the development tools themselves have become more robust every year. But the concept behind Azure App Services, specifically Azure Web Apps, is that the complexity of managing authorization, authentication, service integration, load balancing, and stage deployments is handled centrally by a service that can adapt intelligently to the needs of your organization. This is the brilliance of Azure App Services. I'm Scott J. Peterson, and this is Azure Web Apps. Before we get too far into this session, let me answer a question that a lot of folks have right off the bat. What's the difference between Azure Web Apps and Azure Websites, or the classic Azure website? And the answer is not a lot at the foundation. If you're familiar with creating Azure websites, you're familiar with creating Azure Web Apps. The difference here is that an Azure Web App now has the ability as an Azure App Service to integrate seamlessly with other offerings in the Azure App Service family, like mobile apps, API apps, and logic apps. So just as you've done in the past, if you're a PHP person or Node.js, or you had different flavors of UI or backend technologies that you prefer, you can bring all those and publish your solutions as Azure Web Apps. And although web apps can be developed in virtually any development language and any tool set, including .NET, PHP, Node.js, Python, Java, and even some of the cool marketplace extensions we'll look at a little bit later in this session, web app development using Visual Studio is going to be the primary focus for this session. And mostly we're going to be using MVC, the Model View Controller concepts. And there's really two reasons for this. Number one, MVC right now is currently the most common enterprise level web app development technology. And number two, a lot of the concepts behind ASP.NET Core and Core API development happens using these MVC concepts. So let's take a look at what we're going to cover in this session. First, we're going to cover web app concepts. Now, quite honestly, this session is not going to cover a lot of the fundamentals of web development and is not going to cover a lot of web development techniques. There are a ton of great sessions available for developing, for example, for MVC or web forms or .NET or .NET Core. And chances are you probably have a lot of your own techniques and tools that you're using in your own environments. So we're going to specifically talk about the differences in creating Azure Web Apps as opposed to just a standard web application. So we're going to review some of those concepts. Then we're going to walk through getting started creating an Azure Web App in Visual Studio. Then we're going to spend some time actually developing some web apps and looking at web app management, some of the things that might be a little ambiguous or obscure if you're a developer looking into managing some of these web apps. Then we're going to go into two advanced scenarios, advanced testing and debugging and advanced development. And I'm calling this advanced development because these are some of the scenarios that seem to challenge developers a little bit when they're first adapting to some of these newer concepts. For example, the concept of easy auth and understanding how the authentication mechanisms from an Azure Web App flow into your web experience itself. Then we're going to talk about managing deployments, things like deployment slots and seamlessly moving back and forth based on load balancing or moving staging environments into production, things like that. And then finally, we'll finish up with some next steps, some things that you can do now that you're armed with the knowledge and experience that you've gained in this session on web app development. And then, as always, I'll finish up with some tips and tricks and helpful thoughts to help as you move through your own scenarios. So let's just get right to it and talk about some web app concepts. So let's go over some of these concepts. The Azure documentation is going to throw around a lot of buzzwords or ideas like familiar and fast, enterprise grade, global scale, let's talk about what those mean a little bit. So first off, you can create or upgrade any existing websites that you have. If you have a website right now and it's in production, whether it's a hybrid scenario, whether it's internal to your organization or just something you have up there for fun, you can upgrade it immediately to an Azure Web App. The reason Microsoft says that Azure Web App services are familiar and fast is that you really will have a first-class experience whether you're an ASP.NET, Node.js, Java, PHP, or Python developer. You can even run PowerShell and other scripts or executables in your app service VMs. You can really do whatever you want and integrate it with the web app concepts. There's also a ton of application templates that you can choose from. So, for example, you could, with just a couple of clicks, create a WordPress, Joomla, or Drupal experience and have it hosted within the Azure Web App space. And when we talk about enterprise grade, we're talking about mostly security and compliance. An app service is ISO, SOC, and PCI compliant. You can really manage your content in a way that really harmonizes with whatever your enterprise compliance policies are under essentially every circumstance. And when we talk about global scale, not only can you deploy instances of your Azure Web App in a large number of regions around the world, but your load balancing, failover, and deployment logic can be managed by Azure in a way that's extremely intelligent and totally hands-off if you need it to be. Azure Web Apps are also optimized for DevOps. This really means that you can set up things like continuous integration and deployment with Visual Studio Team Services, GitHub, or Bitbucket, which really promotes updating through test and staging environments and performing A/B testing and managing your apps in app services by using PowerShell or cross-platform command line interfaces or CLIs. You can also connect to software as a service platforms and on-prem data. Right now, there's over 50 connectors for enterprise systems, including SAP, Siebel, and Oracle. You can also have other services like Salesforce and Office 365 integrated, and authentication through Facebook, Twitter, Azure Active Directory, and a number of other third-party and hybrid Azure authentication scenarios. So really, when we're talking about these kind of web app concepts, we're talking about all the stuff that really doesn't have a lot to do with development, but really make all of your solutions shine. Azure Web Apps are part of the new Web Plus mobile suite that's available in the new Azure Management Portal, just like Function Apps, Mobile Apps, API Apps, and Logic Apps. Web App Management is the only Azure app service that is also available in the classic Azure portal. But my suggestion is that you use the new Management Portal, as a number of the configuration and management features of the classic portal are limited. So you can create and manage web apps not just in the Azure Management Portal, but you can also do that right through Visual Studio 2015, which is what we're going to focus on in this session, along with other creation tools of your choice. So in general, we're going to be doing all of our development in Visual Studio 2015 and all of our management in the Azure Management Portal. So let's get right to it and flip over to Visual Studio and create an Azure Web App. So we're over here in Visual Studio 2015 to look at creating an Azure Web App. There's a number of routes that we could go to create a web app. And again, you can do this through a number of tools, not just Visual Studio. Let's walk through a couple of the options and then create one in what I consider the recommended way to create an Azure Web App. So we could go to the Server Explorer and we could right-click on App Service and say Create a New App Service. Fill in our information there and change the type to Web App. Or we could go to New Project and create a project and create an ASP.NET Core web application, or using just the .NET Core or the full .NET framework. But as I'll explain a little bit later in our advanced debugging sessions, there are some known limitations with remote debugging for both of those scenarios. So for this, we're just going to create a standard ASP.NET web application with a full .NET framework. And since we're going to be drawing on concepts from our other sessions related to the Office Point solution, we're going to call this Office Point Live. And we'll say OK. And we're going to select an MVC template. Now, a couple of notes here. We could create an empty template, web forms template, an MVC template. If you look at some of the older documentation there is an option to select ASP.NET 5.0 templates. That has now been replaced with the .NET Core scenario. So typically if you have the latest version of Visual Studio 2015 Update 3, you will no longer see that there. So for this, we're just going to select an MVC. And here's an important note. You can keep authentication as individual user accounts, but as with all the Azure App Services, authentication is primarily designed to be managed at the app service level from within the portal. So we're going to change the authentication here and say no authentication. Now again, we don't have to do this, it's just better. We're going to be demonstrating how to use EasyAuth. So we're going to say no authentication, host in the cloud. We'll say OK, and we're going to give this a name. We'll call this Office Point Live. As our web app name, we'll select our subscription and our resource group. And another comment, just as with all the other sessions related to Azure App Services, pay attention to the app service plan you select, and especially the region. Azure App Services are designed primarily to share resources across regions. So for example, if you've created a function app or an API app that's in Central US, make sure that you create your web app in Central US as well. So we'll say create. It's going to create that project. And again, this is creating it locally. Right now, this is just in the Visual Studio environment, and it's going to create some pointers in Azure. But the project is not published in any way. So we're going to just have the default information that comes out. Let's go ahead and just publish that so it's there. We'll just right click and say publish. It's going to want to know where we can point it to. We'll select Office Point Live. Under our Office Point resources, we'll say OK. Next, it's going to fill in the credentials for us, give us a destination URL. We'll say next and publish. Not very much content, so the publishing process is fairly quick. We'll know that publishing is successful if it loads up the web app in our default browser. One of the cool things in developing with Visual Studio is that we can select the default browser, Edge, Internet Explorer, Firefox, etc., and do our primary development using the browser of our choice. So there we go. Office Point Live is now deployed out to Azure. Let's go over to Office Point Live in the Azure portal and take a look at what gets created. So we've got this new Office Point Live app service that's created. You'll notice right off the bat, we have a lot more options and settings than we would in the classic portal. A couple of them I want to point out. We've got this deployment credentials, deployment slots, deployment options we'll come back to when we talk about publishing to development, staging, and production environments. We have this authentication and authorization setting that we're going to look at later on in the session as well, but this gives us the ability to manage authentication and authorization for multiple third-party services, and to do this across not just our entire web app environment, but across deployment slots, things that you would expect, custom domains, SSL certificates. We can also change the app service plans here easily. There are some advanced tools. There are some items that show up that may not always apply. Easy APIs and easy tables do not always apply depending on your service level. These settings are fairly generic across app services, so they may be important for an Azure API app or a Logic app, for example, but not necessarily for a web app. So in general, what we want to pay attention to for this session is that we've got these deployment credentials, deployment slots, and we've got this authentication that we'll come back to. Okay, great. So let's flip back over to the slide deck and see what we can do next. So when we develop Azure Web Apps, remember that we're able to draw on the power of the .NET framework. We can have layers on top of the framework, but as demonstrated here, everything is sitting on top of .NET Framework or .NET Core. And what we really have on top of it is just helpful assemblies and templates that are drawing from things that exist in the .NET Framework and the .NET Core. So the advantage here to developers is that they can really use the full power of the .NET Framework, but an Azure Web App Service will manage all of the difficult things like control integration, authentication, and some of the other cumbersome tasks. Before we get into writing a little bit of code, let's just review some of these web app concepts. Some of these concepts apply for websites and have always applied. Some of these are new concepts that are specific to Azure Web Apps. The response and request has been around for as long as web development's been around. A request is made and a response is sent. The concept of templates has been around as well, but Azure Web Apps sort of extend this, the idea that we're going to have this skeleton that gets laid out for us that's a template that can give us a bunch of filler code or non-blank scenarios to help us out in our development. Sometimes these templates include configuration settings. In Azure Web Apps, we have this concept of extensions, which is really cool as well. So we can not just connect to other services, but we can apply extensions that would, for example, give us the ability to turn our Azure Web App into a WordPress site or integrate more easily with Office 365. We've also got authentication managed at a very unique layer in Azure Web Apps. Now, we can override this and we can do a more granular level authentication. But the cool thing is we can take advantage of these authentication connectors that are provided by Azure App Services to leverage authentication and, even as we'll show later, grab tokens and make requests on behalf of users through this easy auth scenario. Scaling and availability has always been an issue. If you're familiar at all with Azure Web Development or Azure Development, the ideas of scaling up and scaling out and managing availability are all handled for us. And the other cool piece is software as a service or hybrid scenarios. We can really have any kind of mix that we want, especially in an enterprise where we can have a legacy system, an on-prem system internally. That could be a SharePoint system or a CRM system. We could connect to Office 365. We could connect to our external web apps. We could connect to Salesforce. We could have authentication that comes through Azure Active Directory and our Microsoft account and Twitter or down-level services like Google. Really, the possibilities are endless. But the main idea here is that a lot of the core web development concepts have not changed. We're just adding some new ideas specifically related to Azure Web Apps. So let's flip back over to Visual Studio and start to write a little code to demonstrate some of this. So we're back over in Visual Studio 2015 to take a look at our Office Point Live Azure Web App. And if you recall, we created a web app based on the standard MVC template. So a lot of things should look familiar. We've got our controllers, we've got our views. If we take a look in our default home, we've got this about, contact, and index that were created as views. If we look in our controller, you'll see that it's just loading it up, setting a default message, and passing that into the view bag for the view. So let's just create an additional view here. Let's say add view, and we'll call this fact. We'll have a fact view, and we'll just take that by default. That'll create that view bag fact. Let's just copy some of this content out of our about into fact. We'll just call that fact. So we've got that title and that message. Let's go back into our controller and we'll now create a new result. We'll call that fact, and this will be your fact page. And then if we go into layout, we can go ahead and add a fact here. In layout, we'll just say fact and fact. And for fun, we'll put a breakpoint here just to demonstrate where it's coming, and we'll go ahead and run that at Internet Explorer. And you'll see that we've got the default index page created. If we go to fact, then sure enough, we're hitting our fact page, and it loads up our fact page and says your fact page. So that's great, but that's a little bit boring. So let's see if we can do a couple of other things here. Let's take that off. And you'll recall from our previous sessions in Mastering Azure App Services, we created functions and logic and API apps as well that we can integrate. Let's see how we might integrate one of our API apps into our web app. If we right-click over the solution, we can now say Add REST API Client. As a note, if you're using older versions of Visual Studio or following older documentation, this used to say Add Azure API. They've now made this menu item Add REST API Client, But from the client dialog, we can select an Azure asset. And here again is where it's important to make sure that your assets are created in the regions. So now if we go to Add Azure Asset, we'll see that we have this Office Point APIs that was created in the API session available to us. And let's watch what happens when we say OK. It's downloading the metadata for that API app. It's actually doing a process here similar to a NuGet package, as you notice there. We'll refresh this, rebuild. And when it's brought in, it doesn't necessarily recognize all the namespaces. A namespace that gets created in this API is this string collection, and it's confused. It says which one do you want to use, and we are going to give it officepointlive.apis.models, and then it'll be happy with that. So let's go ahead and rebuild it again. And there we go, successful. So now we've got this out-of-the-box MVC, but now we have all the functionality of the APIs in there. So let's take a look at what that might look like if we were to pull in some of those API methods here. Let's say var client equals new Office Point APIs. And then we could say client.facts.get random. So like always, we think it's fun to get a random fact. So we'll say var fact equals client.facts.getRandom. Just make a note here that we're pulling in the APIs, and notice that we've got a facts object, we've got news, notification, sales, all of these great things that we can bring directly into our web app because we're leveraging the Azure API apps. Let's put a breakpoint there and let's see what happens. Right now all we're doing is just getting a fact back. We'll run that. Click on fact, and sure enough, there are only 14 blimps in the world. Wow, that's actually kind of a low number. So that is an interesting fact. That's great, but notice when it loads up, it's just going to show your fact page. Let's go ahead and pop that in. Let's say in the view, let's actually return that fact, and then we'll go to our facts view. And let's just put a paragraph in here, and we'll say model.description. So we know that fact has a description there. And instead of your fact page, we'll say here's an interesting fact. We'll put a breakpoint there. And sure enough, we get another fact. Pearls melt in vinegar. Yep. Yeah. Wow. Okay. That's kind of weird. Okay. So great. And if we keep running that, there we've got it. Pearls melt in vinegar. So the cool thing here is that we're able to just go within our own region and grab one of those APIs from the other Azure API app and pull that into our web app pretty seamlessly, actually. So let's just take a look at it. Doing a couple more of these, we can say news.getAsync. So now here's an interesting scenario. So now we've got an asynchronous call here, and it's going to choke. It's going to say, what in the heck are we going to do there? Well, why don't we just do this? Why don't we just say task and return that result? Let's just make this asynchronous, and we'll just say we're just going to use that. And now we're going to make that an async method. And now that all goes away. So let's see if that works. Actually, we'll say news, and we'll say news.firstOrDefault, and then we'll return var first. We'll call this first news item equals, and we'll return the first news item. And then in our controller, our fact controller, we've still got description. Let's see how that turns out. Remember, now we're going to do this using the async await pattern. and call one of our Azure APIs in our Azure Web App. We'll say fact, and it did truly pull back a latest news item, longtime conservative activist Phyllis Schlafly dead at 92. So that's not very interesting, but it probably is a piece of latest relevant news. Okay, and then so calling it asynchronously, and we'll put that up on the page, and there we go. So pretty cool, and we just kind of do this all day long. And again, we're not really going to review a bunch of the MVC development concepts, but these are some concepts that are specific to web apps that kind of make it cool. And now before we get into some of the more advanced development concepts with Azure Web Apps, let's flip back over the slide deck and take a look at web app management to make sure we're set up to be the most productive we could possibly be. Earlier in this session, we took a look at a long list of web app management settings and configuration items for Azure Web Apps, and a number of those apply. Some of them aren't that interesting. The ones that I think are most important to developers are this list that I have here that we're going to go in and take a look at. First one is extensions. This is a really cool concept here that's sort of grown with Azure Web App services over the last couple of years. The idea that we can just create an Azure Web App and then apply an extension. For example, turn that web app into a WordPress site, or add gulp extensions or PHP extensions or things of that nature. Makes it really easy, and we'll take a look at a couple of those. And then one of the coolest new things in Azure Web App Management, authentication and authorization. We're going to go in and do some preliminary authentication setup, and then we'll come back in the advanced part of this session and really drill into that. We're also going to take a look at backups, SSL certificates, and domain names. These are some areas that there's some confusion sometimes with administrators and developers on how to set these up and how to manage them. And then finally, we're going to take a look at altering the app service plans and taking a look at how that might affect our ability to scale, and specifically how to manage deployment slots. So let's go over into the Azure Management Portal now and take a look at a few of these things before we get back into writing some code. Okay, we're back over here in the Azure Management Portal. We're going to take a look at managing some settings that are important for development for our Office Point Live Azure Web App. First thing we're going to look at is extensions. You'll notice here in the list of possible configuration settings as we scroll down, under Development Tools we have Extensions. And I've got no extensions added here by default. Let's say Add. Take a look at a couple of these. So if we scroll through this, we'll see just about every kind of extension you can imagine. These are either written by Microsoft or other third parties, even by individuals, and you can, as a developer, create web app extensions and submit them as well. You'll notice that we even have things like WordPress extensions, gulp extensions, PHP extensions. We're going to add the Application Insights extension here. This will give us the ability to view a lot of information about what's going on in our app, exception handling, and traffic and monitoring. Typically, they require you to accept legal terms. We'll say OK, and this is going to go ahead and add that extension. We'll click OK, and now we're all set. Now let's take a look at authorization. And we're going to extend this a little bit later on in the session, but let's just look at some basic authentication scenarios, and let me clarify here. So previously, when you create an Azure website in ASP.NET or PHP or MVC, you're going to manage authentication at the web config level or specifically in your solution. Azure Web Apps give us the ability to sort of do this globally and then do this per deployment slot as well. So the first thing we'll want to do is turn on authentication and take a look at what we have here for options. So we can add extensions here for authentication as well, and we can have third-party extensions, but by default we have this list of these 5 providers: Azure AD, Facebook, Google, Twitter, Microsoft account. You'll notice that none of them have been configured. We also have an action to take when a request is not authenticated. So when somebody first comes to our web app, what do we want to have happen? And the option we have is to take no action, which means that we can just do authentication in our code. And sometimes we'll use a combination of this, or we can say, don't allow a user to view anything on our website or in our web app unless they've authenticated with one of these services. So we're going to say log in with Azure Active Directory, and we're just going to configure this one by default. Now, as a note, we can have all of these configured. We can have multiple authentication providers involved in the process. So we'll just select Express, and we'll select an existing Azure AD app. We've got this Office Point Live app that's available in my Azure Active Directory, and we'll say OK. And I'll go ahead and save that. Let me just flip over to the Active Directory. I'm going to look at this through the Classic portal, but you'll notice here in the default directory for Active Directory in this tenant, if I go to Applications, I have this Office Point Live. The great thing here is that all the configuration is done for you to connect this. If I go to Configure, we've got this information about our client IDs and other information and how it signs on, and you'll see that all this has been pre-populated for us, which makes it really nice. We can, of course, go down here and extend scopes if we need to do whatever we have to. But now authentication is set up so that when somebody comes to this web app, they're going to have to authenticate against the Azure Active Directory before they view the website. And again, we'll go in and take a look at a couple of these other ones in our advanced scenarios. So now let's take a look at backups. It's a fairly simple process, but some folks get a little bit confused when they're administering this. Most developers are not always the best administrators. We tend to do it for ourselves and aren't always the best at doing it, but it's fairly straightforward. For example, we could just say we want to have our storage configured, our Azure storage that's connected here, or the entire web app backed up, or the databases backed up. We can have those on different schedules, and selecting and managing a schedule is very easy. We just say we want to turn backup on, and we want this to happen every 5 hours, start here, and retain this many backups. And we'll say OK, and we'll save that there. We'll go ahead and discard those changes so we don't really care about them. We'll close that and close that. Now, one more I want to look at is the idea of SSL certificates and domain names. So by default, all resources that point to azurewebsites.net have SSL enabled. Now, this is fine if you want to have your website.azurewebsites.net, but if you want to have a custom domain name or an alias, then it's important not just to set up the custom domain, but also the SSL certificate. So let's go to SSL certificates. And it's really a straightforward process here. You can import an app certificate that already exists, or you can upload a certificate. When you upload a certificate, this needs to be a PFK. Here's just one tip. If you're doing a lot of web app development, it might be helpful to get what's called a wildcard certificate that essentially lets you do star.domainname.extension. So for example, I have a SSL certificate that is wildcard.liquiddaffodil.com that lets me set up any aliases I want. So I don't just have to have www.liquiddaffodil.com. I can have officepoint.liquiddaffodil.com, and the SSL certificate handles that. So you basically import it, you set it up here, and then you add a binding to officepoint.liquiddaffodil.com. It's going to point to the certificate, and then your SSL is all set up. But in order to do that, we need to make sure that we're managing our custom domains. So by default, you're going to have your domain name.azurewebsites.net listed. If you want to assign that to a more friendly or a company-specific name, you go ahead and add a host name. And then you're going to enter the host name, and it's going to want to validate this. But before this happens, you're going to have to make sure that you have a DNS entry that will point to this. So you can see that I've already set up officepoint.liquiddaffodil.com. Now, Azure by default does not manage DNS and does not usually host your domain name. You usually have a provider that does that, or you're doing that within your organization. So let's go over to DNS Manager for my hosting provider and take a look at how we'd set that up. So you'll notice that I've also added here this entry, not just officepoint.liquiddaffodil.com, but officepointlive.liquiddaffodil.com, and this IP address we pull from here. So it says use this IP address in your DNS settings for your A records. So we've got this set up in our A record. But one other thing needs to happen. We need to be able to let Azure know that we approve this process, we can usually set up an AW Verify, or we can just point it directly to AzureWebsites.net. So here I've set up a CNAME record, officepointlive.liquiddaffodil.com. I want to point to officepointlive.azurewebsites.net. So now if we go in here and add a host name, I can say officepointlive.liquiddaffodil.com. And when I say validate, it's actually going to go out and pull through that DNS and see if I'm the owner of that and see if it can be verified. So it's checking domain ownership and the hostname availability. And now everything's validated. Looks great. Okay, so now when somebody comes into officepoint.liquiddaffodil.com or officepointlive.liquiddaffodil.com, they'll point to our Azure website. So that's pretty slick. So one thing we can do now is we can go ahead and test. If I go ahead and copy this URL, just pull up Edge, I've got officepoint.liquiddaffodil, and it wants me to log in with my Microsoft ID. We can also test the SSL version of that. And you'll notice it wants us to log in with our Microsoft ID, and it's a secure site that has been verified by VeriSign. Okay, so that's cool. Let's take a look at one more thing. Let's take a look at scaling related to our app service plan. So we can scale up, which will basically give us the ability to pick a different tier. Right now I'm in the standard tier. We can scale out with the way that our app service plan is deployed regionally. But I just want to point out this scale up scenario. So if we come down here and pick one of these free or shared scenarios, there's some things that are not available. By default, when you create one, typically it's going to have a basic B1 scenario. And this is fine for a lot of instances. But one thing that you miss if you don't go to the standard app service tier is this important thing, these slots, these deployment slots. With deployment slots, we have the ability to say, you know what, create a staging environment, a production environment, a testing environment, create these different slots, and I'm actually going to publish content out to these different environments based on these deployment slots, and then we can manage those, we can swap them out, we can do all kinds of great things with them. So if you're just in a small scenario where it's just a fairly static website and you're not really worried about going through all of that DevOps type process, then it's fine. Go with one of the basic or free tiers. But if you want to use deployment slots and have this ease of manageability between environments, then use standard or above. And if we were to look at deployment slots, you can see that I haven't added one, but it's very easy to do, and we'll actually publish out to one of these a bit later. So I could call this, for example, staging, and I'm going to use that as the configuration source. And now we've got this officepointlive.staging that's running. We'll go back and take a look at that a little bit later on, but now we know that that's been made available. Okay, so great. So let's go back over to the slide deck and take a look at doing some more advanced scenarios now that we're familiar with our web app management.